Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, both in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to make numerous advances in the southern and eastern section of the front line, advancing within the western and eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhia region, the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, to the southwest of Pokrovsk, east of Pokrovsk, and to the south of Kostiantynivka, as well as the north of Donetsk. The Ukrainians in turn launched several counterattacks, advancing in the direction of Rydkodub, regaining their positions within the western parts of the town. A counterattack in the direction of Novoserhivka, regaining some positions within that town as well, and in the northern section of the front line in the Sumy region, where they managed to re-enter another town. So the Ukrainians have launched three separate counterattacks in three separate sections of the front line, re-entering three separate towns. In the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians have managed to operationally encircle the town as well. In the northern section of the front line in the direction of Counteroffensive, the Ukrainians managed to cut off the road leading into the town, cutting off the main supply line of the Russians, leaving just a small area of open fields remaining to resupply their forces, which means the Russians are practically fully encircled and definitively operationally encircled. The Ukrainians flanked the town from the northern flank, where they managed to cut off the road, drive up to the river line, and cut off the northern flank completely, while entering a foothold in the eastern parts of the town, while fighting continues on the western and southern parts of the town, where the Ukrainians have cut off the supplies and are now working on storming the town directly head on, as is confirmed with this geolocated footage here. Now we see that the Ukrainians are continuing their counterattacks in this section of the front line, where they're looking to displace one of the flanks of the Russian incursion here across the border area. One of the reasons for this is its close proximity to the same river here in the Kursk region, where a statement by Syrskyi, which just happened today, he stated in a meeting with Zelensky that it should be one of the main objectives of the Ukrainians to re-enter and regain their positions within the Kursk and Belgorod regions. This means that Syrskyi wants to prioritize re-entering into the northern sections of the border in the Russian side of the border, now that they have lost practically everything they held, and to re-enter and regain these positions despite the devastating consequences that they had their first time around. And this makes absolutely no sense, because the Austrian Colonel Markus Reisner spoke with his Ukrainian colleagues a couple of weeks ago, and he quoted them saying that for every 25 to 30 kilometers of the front line, the Ukrainians have one brigade active covering that section of it. And this brigade is not a NATO standard 5,000 soldier brigade. Instead, it is between 2,000 and 2,500 soldiers in this brigade. This means giving them the upper scale of the manpower and lower scale of the distance. That means 25 kilometers for every 2,500 soldiers, or 100 soldiers for every kilometer, or one soldier for every 10 meters. That's just over 100,000 soldiers for a 1,000-kilometer long front line, compared to the Russians, numbering somewhere around 700,000 or 800,000 soldiers fighting in Ukraine, with an additional 200,000 or so in reserve, which would add up to about a 10-to-1 advantage on the entire front line. Now, it was never stated that this was the entire front line. It could have been a specific section of the front line, but doesn't change the fact that the Ukrainians are significantly outnumbered and very stretched thinly across the front line, and this would only worsen with additional assaults into Russian territories and additional offensive operations. Instead, the Ukrainians should be focusing on defense, securing the front line, stabilizing it, and then taking advantages wherever they can, like they're doing in the Sumy region, where such a maneuver to cut off the supplies to Counteroffensive, if they're able to hold this, it would have been a large success on a very small scale. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to re-enter Rydkodub again, where they continued offensive operations in the direction of the town to try and regain control of it, and push in the direction of Nove to gain control over the main logistical hub for the Russian forces in this section across the Serbs river line of the front line, where the Russians are attempting to stabilize the situation and push further down south towards Liman. The Ukrainians are working on the northern flank, despite the operational encirclement of the Russian forces on the Ukrainian forces by their push towards Lushkanova and along the river line. The Ukrainians are still pouring in additional forces to push into Ritkodub, where they are constantly under fire by the Russian forces and diving directly into a fire control zone of the Russian forces that is being heavily bombarded by both artillery and drones around the clock. Going further south to the Donetsk direction, the Russians have managed to advance to the east of Belora, gaining control over some fortified positions along the forest patch areas. The Russians continue offensive operations here on the eastern flank of Belora, following the capture of Delivka in the direction of the town to gain control over it, the fortified positions on the northern flank of it, and connect with the Chesav Yar section of the western parts of the canal, aligning the front line along the canal, the western parts of it, all the way up towards Hrihorivka, significantly boosting the supplies of the Russian forces in the section of the front line here east of Kostantinivka, while also developing offensive operations towards the city itself. To the south of Kostantinivka, the Russians advanced both within Yablunivka on the northern and southern flanks of the town. On the southern flank of the town, the Russians continued offensive operations to the south of the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth. The Russians are here working up north towards the town itself, creating additional roads into the town from the southern flank, while at the same time pushing through the town itself on the southern and northern parts of the river line. That separates the town into two parts. The Russians are advancing along both sides, while at the same time they are storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of the town, as they look to gain control over the road that leads into Stepanivka from the south. In their offensive operation towards operational encirclement of Kostantinivka, the Russians are now developing offensive operations in the direction of Stepanivka, Dolhabelka, Mykolaiv on the east, as well as Poltavka, Popiv and Rusin in the west, while continuing offensive operations storming the fortified line from Troshkivka towards Pokrovsk in the west. Speaking of those operations, the Russians continue storming the defensive line, gaining control over fortified positions in the southern flank of Novotorets, as they continue offensive operations towards the town, attempting to enter it from the southern flank, push through the southern and eastern parts of it to gain control over the eastern bank of the river line, the parts of Novotorets within that part, before moving on towards Boykivka and expanding to control within the Rasina and down towards Novoekonomishne from the north and from the south, as well as directly from the east in the Mirna direction. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to re-enter Novoserhivka, pushing the Russians back towards the town as they are attempting to flank the Russian offensive operations towards Odashne, storming the town from the south. The Russians have recently been advancing in the direction of it, but the Ukrainians are holding their positions within it. And now with the flanking maneuver in the direction of Novoserhivka, they're looking to cut off the supplies of the Russian forces pushing in the direction of Odashne. Limiting their supply lines will allow them to target the remaining supply lines with their drones effectively. At the same time, the Russians stormed the town of Moravka from the south, expanding the zone of control within the town and pushing onwards towards the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Russians have been developing offensive operations towards Novopavlivka for the past few weeks, especially in the southern flank of the town, while the eastern flank has remained static. The Ukrainians continue attempting to regain control over Dashne and stop the offensive operations from the south. With the new offensive operations in the direction of Moravka from the east, the Russians are expanding their offensive operations towards Novopavlivka on a wider front, limiting the Ukrainian counterattack capabilities and strengthening their offensive operations towards Novopavlivka from the three directions. Further south, the Russians managed to advance here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, expanding the zone of control within Tolstoy, as well as west of Pidupna, where they are advancing towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians that remain here in the southwest outskirts, both along their main highway and to the south of it, storming both of them at the same time from the eastern flank through their weak spot. At the same time, they're pushing to gain full control of Tolstoy, gaining control of which will allow them to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and develop offensive operations further north towards the remaining settlements on the southern bank of the Vovcha River line. In the eastern parts of the Zaporizhia region, the Russians expand zone of control in the northern and western flanks of Malinivka, gaining control over the additional road across the river line to the northern flank of Malinivka for offensive operations in the direction of Poltavka, advancing along the main road towards Vesely and Zeleny High, as well as along the western flank towards Vysoke, where they managed to gain control over several forest lines here on the western flank of Malinivka, developing the offensive operations across the river line, both in the northern flank and in the western flank of the river lines. In the western parts of the Zaporizhia region, the Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions within Kamyansky, gaining control over an additional road from the Lubkova direction in the direction of Kamyansky, gaining control over all of the fortified positions along the river line, and pushing the Ukrainians back towards the outskirts of Kamyansky towards the fortified positions north of the town. At the same time, offensive operations continue in the Dacha area, where the Russians are storming the Ukrainian positions, building after building, basement after basement. Significant offensive operations by the Russians continue all across the front line, while the Ukrainians are building up a reserve for new offensive operations, despite the difficult situation across the front line. The Ukrainians are attempting to disrupt Russian offensive operations by launching their own. Instead, as we saw last year, the Ukrainian counterattacks and new offensive operations do not impact the Russian offensive operations in the east and in the south. Instead, it simply leads to the Russians doubling down on those offensive operations, building up reserves to counter the Ukrainian offensive. Instead, now that the Russians have built their own reserve, a Ukrainian counterattack or a new offensive would simply allow the Russians to activate their own reserves for a counter push towards the Ukrainians, and it could have devastating effects on the Ukrainian forces instead. In conclusion, the situation is much worse for the Ukrainians this year compared to last year, and the trend continues in that direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.